Subramanian. Dr. Vidya completed her PhD and MPhil from the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. During this, she also was a doctoral fellow at Transnational Research Group of the Max Weber Foundation German Humanities Institute abroad. She has an interdisciplinary background in sociology, educational studies, and developmental studies. Her research focuses on public and private partnerships in education, entrepreneurship, and governance in post-liberalization India. Presently, she is an associate professor at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. And before joining the Jindal University, she also taught at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Bombay. And she was also a consultant at Tata Trust. So over to you, Vidya. Vidya, we will have 40 to 45 minutes for the talk, which will be followed by the Q&A. And everyone who is present online, you can put your questions in Q&A box and we will read out. And if you want to ask, you can ask your questions directly to Vidya. Yeah. Over to you, Vidya.
Thank you, Rama. Thank you so much. And thank you to CPR for this platform to present my work. Could my presentation be um, Uh, so thank you again. My talk today draws on my PhD work. I conducted my fieldwork sometime in 2014 to 2016. It's quite opportune in many ways as I'm speaking about something regarding education reforms. And it's at a time when next week Delhi is also going into elections. We have the big sort of debate between Aam Aadmi Party, BJP. When I did my field work in 2014, it was the time when the Aam Aadmi Party was coming into the whole political space. And it was coming around about the same time where a number of education reforms were getting a lot of publicity in the public sphere. My PhD work at that point in time was interestingly following a group of professionals who were associated with this fellowship program called the Teach for India program. Many of you would be familiar with it. You must have heard about it. It's quite popular. You may have interacted with a number of fellows who worked with Teach for India. Teach for India is a transnational program. Just sort of, right. So before I go into sort of situating the larger context of my research and how I went about doing it, I'll sort of speak a little bit on the transnational program, which is Teach for India. Teach for India is the Indian offshoot of what is the Teach for America program. You have a number of Teach for models across the globe operating in different capacities in different education systems across different countries across the world. My analysis really is fixed on how the program originated in Bombay. It came at the cusp of a number of urban governance reforms and a number of philanthropic efforts that were happening in the city of Bombay at that point in time in 2008, 2009. So I look at Bombay as the site where this intervention sort of took shape. How did it take shape? Who were the actors and organizations involved as it came into the picture? It was also closely associated with older NGOs that were already working in the space of Bombay. And then I look at how the program sort of works in a segment of government schools in the city of Delhi. So what exactly was the nature of the public-private partnership in the city of Delhi? Did the program have certain initiatives in the space of the government schooling system? Did it work? Did it not work? Those were the kind of questions that I explored in the space of my PhD. In this paper, specifically, what I'm looking at is the trajectory of these professionals, the fellows who are associated with the Teach for India program. I'm looking at their movement. What were their choices or their aspirations for joining the program? How did they work within the space of the school education system in the city of Delhi? And how did they see their work in the education space? What were they learning over there through their engagement with the government schooling system? And do they take that knowledge in many ways to further or to find new careers after the space that they work in? And what's very interesting, the NGO network that a lot of the professionals end up working in itself thinks about education and education reform. So I'm really looking at what are called these conduits, or these individuals themselves as being channels connecting certain ideas of reform, and how the government itself thinks about education reform. How are these channels of knowledge moving from one space to the other space? How are they influencing each other? It's co-constituted in many ways, right? Uh, how I sort of situate these reforms, it's also at a particular time period. You, of course, know very well with the whole neoliberalization process in the 90s, you see a number of urban reforms happening. And what's very interesting is that to look at the subset of education reforms, it becomes very necessary to speak really or understand what were the kinds of larger urban governance reforms happening. And in the city of Bombay at that point in time, we have something called a collective of organizations coming together. It comes together under the ambit of what is called the Bombay First model. The Bombay First model, again, is modeled on the London First model. So there's this idea as to how are we going to make Bombay into a certain kind of a city. And a number of reform measures there also look at not just urban governance, civil society issues, specifically what it means for changing the nature of education as well. So these individuals, these collective of actors, whether they are bureaucrats, whether they are private consultants, whether they are transnational, international organizations, collectively in the policy space, they're looking at education also as an important site of reform. And it is at that juncture where also around about in the 2000s, you also see a number of big policy reforms coming in the space of education. So one of the biggest sort of policy measures in the space of education that a number of us are familiar with is, of course, the right to education that comes in 2009. But outside of that, what is also interesting is there is a quite a prominent push by the government itself on furthering public-private partnerships. And in 2013, what happens is the CSR sort of act, which also says that we must have private actors actively contributing 2% towards social endeavors. Now, what those social endeavors are, etc., at that point in time, it wasn't very clearly mapped. But today, of course, in the CSR space, there's a lot more understanding of where do you want to see private sector money going, or private sector resources moving or shifting towards social sector reform. And education here is a big, big site where corporate philanthropy is one of the key mover. Okay, so this is something that is very easily visible. I've taken this image from the organization's website. Now, if you look at this, you see, of course, young professionals, young individuals, keen about the fact that their work or their input can have some sort of a impact, social sector change. You are the individual, you can make the change. It is very important here that as I'm saying this, there is a certain understanding also of the language that I'm using. The individual can make the change. You're not really thinking so much of the system or the complexity of the education schooling system. It's of the individual and how any set of individuals can make their mark and make their change. Now, what is the Teach for India program all about? Some of you would be familiar with it, but I'm just sort of going again into the basics. What is the sort of crux of the model really? It borrows largely from the American model. It's a 2-year fellowship. So what it says is that there's a set of criteria you apply for the fellowship. You have to go through a range of tests, interviews, etc. But it's primarily a 2-year fellowship to work in both government schools. Uh, Please do register that I will be unpacking what I mean by government schools here, because the government schooling system in India itself is highly stratified. So they work in a certain segment of government schools and also what are categorized as low income private schools. Okay, that's also an emerging category over the past 2 decades, the low income private school. When we say private school, we often automatically think about certain elite posh schools, but that's not necessarily the category that one must have as the reference point for when we say private schools. So here, there is a certain segment that's been documented in literature as the low-income private school and the government school. And here, when I'm speaking specifically of the government school, the Teach for India Fellowship largely works in the municipal corporation schools. They do not work in KVs. They do not work in Sarvodaya schools. They work again in certain Delhi government administered schools that run from class 6 to class 12, but they do not operate in a slightly better segment of government schools. They do not operate in Navodaya Vidyalayas, Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas, Kendra Vidyalayas, Rashtriya Pratibha Vikas Vidyalayas. They do not operate in this space. It is important to register this because it also really speaks about standards. Here in these schooling systems, if you have to work, you have to have a teacher education degree, a B.Ed, M.Ed, you have to be qualified, you have to take certain teacher eligibility tests. These fellows in that way are not qualified professionally as a school teacher. They have a certain set of training, yes, which is 3 to 4 weeks before they enter a government school, but they are working in a segment of government schools that cater to the lowest rung of the society. Students whose parents are vegetable vendors, domestic workers, themselves uneducated. Okay, so it's a very, very low rung. I'd like to sort of specify that. Now, who are these fellows when they come to work? These fellows, at least in the fieldwork that I did, they largely came from two categories. They were either fresh graduates, that is, they had completed their graduate degree, their BTech or their BSc or their BCom, or they were professionals in the way that they had worked in some capacity in the corporate space. So many of them were IT professionals, business management professionals. They were all looking at opportunities in many ways to give back. They found it necessary in some ways to work in the social sector, but having never really understood how they would enter the space, what they would do to give back, education became, for the lack of a better word, a nice soft space to work in. You know, you are working with those who are needy. You feel that you're making a difference there. You can volunteer, you can do good. And a lot of IT companies, as some of you would be familiar with, also offer sabbaticals, wherein a lot of professionals can take time out from their regular job and work in fellowship programs like TFI or other sort of sabbatical models to work or volunteer with those from humbler backgrounds, those who are more needy, right? So there's also a very clear set idea of what is the vision of the Teach for India program. They operate with the idea that you're not going there to improve pedagogy, teaching, learning, nothing critical. You're there really in many ways. The model or the vision of the program is also very individually geared. It is that you can sell the fellowship as something wherein through your work in the schooling system, you're going to be able to garner some qualities of leadership, management, entrepreneurship. These are very interesting keywords because they can then use the experience there to also showcase their work after the fellowship to present themselves as individuals with a certain set of managerial skills of knowing how to manage the school education system. That knowledge in many ways is useful for them to work or transition into a policy space, which is what a lot of these individuals are keen for. The sites that I look at, like I said, Bombay in some ways where the program originated, and Delhi where the program took shape because that's where I was located. And that's where I saw the program unfold at a critical juncture when you also see a new political party coming into the space, a political party which at that point in time and even now sort of caters very strongly to the idea that education is a huge sort of stepping stone for reform. Teach for India program also has its roots program. This is again briefly just sort of categorizing a range of donors who support the program. It originated, of course, it began in 2009. A couple of things that I think I should say before I forget is that the Teach for India program also has linkages to the Akanksha Foundation. The CEO for Teach for India is Shaheen Mistry. She started this organization called the Akanksha Foundation in the 1990s. So what's interesting really here is that a transnational sort of offshoot has its roots also, or it sort of meets with local NGOs that existed in Bombay. So Akanksha Foundation already was working in the space of government schooling in Bombay. They were getting their funding from Thermax Foundation. So when the whole model proposal came in 2009, Shaheen Mistry, who came on board to become the CEO for Teach for India, collaborated with a number of individuals who are associated with BCG, with the Piramal Foundation. So you see this sort of coming together of existing NGOs and another new sort of transnational organization coming and adapting itself to the Indian context. It has as its underpinning model a lot of similarity to the American model. Of course, a key difference with the American model is that the American model mandates that the fellows must locate or situate themselves with a teacher training program. So when they're doing their 2-year fellowship, they must also simultaneously be a part of the alternative teaching certification. So there's a certain sort of teacher certification that they have to get as they're doing their American fellowship. In India, that certification does not exist. They do not have to associate themselves with any teacher education program in the Indian context. So whether you're working in Bombay or in Delhi or in Hyderabad or in Bangalore, it operates in 8 cities across the country. You're not integrating or even associating yourself with formal teacher education routes here at all. Okay, so you have this 4-week training program, after which you then enter the school system, whether it is the local government schooling system or a low-income private school. You work there for 2 years. You teach largely from standard, say, 1 to standard 8. In the city of Pune, I'm told that they go up to 9 and 10 as well. In Delhi also, perhaps over the past few years, they've sort of moved up the scale and ladder. But there is also a lot of there isn't full commensurability in the sense that do fellows teach all the grades across all 8 cities. There are differences in the cities and the ways in which they operate. A lot of my knowledge is based on the Delhi and the Bombay model.
What is the medium of instruction?
Pardon?
What is the medium of instruction?
The medium of instruction, thank you for asking, is English. Okay, so that's also something to clearly note. The fellows do not need to know or have a hang of the regional language of the schooling system that they are situated in. What is mandated, of course, is that they need to know English, and they teach largely subjects such as English, maths, and social sciences. And when I did field work, they were open, or they were sort of starting out in teaching science as well, but that was, I don't know whether they have moved full-fledged into teaching science. But the focus was English, and the subject were maths, social sciences. And social sciences had a very low priority, okay, because social sciences in a lot of the corporation schools also taught in the regional language. Okay, so their focus really is on English and maths. In fact, their testing assessments is only for English and maths. Okay, the outcomes that they map after every year of their work in the fellowship program is only for English and maths. So you can clearly also see what their learning indicators are, the very, very rudimentary learning indicators. Let's just keep it at that for the sake of more standard clarity. It's also important to understand here that the model is actually not a very large model, right? It's just operating in 8 cities across the country. It's operating in a certain segment of government schools. It's not widespread. It is not like everywhere in that way. It's very urban in its location. It's focused also in English medium. So then, does it really make such a huge impact? I mean, it's so small in its scale and its approach in that way. It's only moved up to 8 cities. But if you look at the Teach for America model, it's sort of moved across its 50 states. Whereas here in India, it's largely located only up to 8 cities. The alumni at that juncture in 2023, that's the last data that I have mapped over here, is only around, say, 4,000. But if you look at the impact, how are they thinking of impact? Their impact here is not really with regard to the children that they teach in the 8 cities. The impact that they're actually mapping is with regard to what these fellows do after the program. And that is very key here, because these fellows don't see the school as where they're going to make their impact. The impact that they are making is going to be outside the school system in the various endeavors that they do outside the schooling system. And that is where even the whole sort of focus or the vision of the program comes into play. This was again just, it's a very, very rudimentary like sort of web over here, or a matrix of some sorts, to be able to see the kinds of non-profit sector actors that a number of the professionals have moved into. Yeah. Again, this is a much more dated web, in the sense that I'm sure that this web is a lot more complex and broader today than the web that I present here. Now, like I said, the scale of the model is pretty small, but what we really need to focus on is who are the alumni and where are they going, and what are the larger sort of aspirations and the motivations with which they take their passion to work in education into the policy space. Now, these are individuals who, see, from the outside, when you're looking at the social sector, or from the outside, you're looking at education, your experiences are often based on how did you experience the school system? What were your memories of going to school? You're not really looking at the school as a larger system. Your memory is largely, okay, what did I study in school? Who were my friends? What was my... It's a very personalized, anecdotal sort of engagement with the school system. When you're studying in your school at the age that you're in, your memory is shaped of schooling from that particular way. So for a lot of these individuals, one of the key distinctions that they see when they start working in the school system is the distinction between where you studied, what kind of opportunities you got, and where did you end up. So the first sort of question that comes to many of them is that maybe school is the site where the biggest difference can happen. So the class difference, the kind of school that you went to, and where should you actually work to make better things happen. Now, they have absolutely, obviously, a large number of them haven't really studied in the local municipal school system. They do not know the larger governance structure of education or anything of that nature. But when they engage with the schooling system, it almost becomes their first sight of learning about social disparity and difference. It becomes their first sight to say, oh, this school doesn't have public infrastructure. Oh, this school does not have electricity. Oh, this school does not have teachers who are coming to school. It becomes their first way or vision to understand a system very different from the system they experienced. So it becomes the first sight to experience or understand class in a very real way. It's in a very real way. I mean, growing up, you know that there are distinctions and differences between you and others, but it's for the first time that you're actually operating within the system to see, okay, oh, so this is what the system is all about, right? And what is interesting here is that long term, as I said, none of them are interested in becoming teachers. So they're seeing the school system as a site to learn what is it, what kind of interventions can I take from here to develop and make a bigger change. Now, I begin with my first sort of question with a number of the fellows is that when I asked them why, some of them were working in very comfortable jobs. Why would you want to work in this space? And for a number of them, the answer came that they genuinely wanted to be able to reach out and work in the social sector, but they had no clue as to why they wanted to work in the social sector. And also, very, very importantly, they saw the social sector as a space where you're not going to get paid. It's very interesting because if you look at the trajectory itself of the non-profit or the NGO 1980s and what it is now. And one of the key sort of characteristics of the non-profit sector today is that it's a lot more professionalized. There's also a lot more engagement of corporate philanthropy in this space. So for a number of these actors, even the choice to volunteer, it isn't with the idea that volunteer meaning without any sort of support for how long. The 2-year fellowship gives them a very, very reasonable stipend. It's not a very great stipend or whatever it is. So clearly they have savings or they come from backgrounds where their family will support them to move and complete this fellowship, right? So in that way, socio-culturally, almost all my respondents were upper middle class, English educated, having gone to some of the most best colleges in India. So when they're coming to work here, they are able to give the 2 years of their time to work in the school system. How are they looking at education? This is very essential and very important because it really speaks really on how a number of the non-state institutions or the more dominant non-state institutions feeding into the policy vocabulary, how do they envision education? And here, it isn't really education in the way in which, of course, education is for citizenship, for democracy, for public good. But their vision really is that the education must have the end goal of being able to give these students a certain set of skill sets to be able to get jobs. So for a number of the families who were very, very vocally and very supportive of the Teach for India program, the fact that the children went to English medium sections and were in many ways going to be conversant in English was a huge thing for these parents. Because for them, they felt that, I'm just quoting here, a vegetable vendor family member, the father who I interviewed, who told me that I don't want my son to stand in the sun like this with, like how I am standing. At least he can go and work in the mall. So you are actually, that vignette that he shares with me is actually in many ways telling of a certain aspiration of generational mobility that he wants for his child. He doesn't want his child to do the kind of physical labor that he's doing, but the language and the skill set that he will get will at least allow him to be upwardly mobile into a certain precarious and much burgeoning retail economy. I'm not here, of course, exploring the labor dimensions of where these children go, etc. But it was very telling for me really from the vignettes itself as to how parents themselves see English medium education. Now, what are these individuals taking from the school system that they're working in? I'm here quoting, or I'm reading out from the slide itself. This is of a respondent, Girish. Girish has been working in IBM for a number of years before he, and IIT Delhi as well, before he takes this sabbatical to work in the fellowship. And for him, he really wants to work in the education sector, but he has no clue or understanding of the inner dynamics of the system. So the fellowship really helped him understand, a lot of the curricular dimensions of, say, how maths, science, English is there. And what's very interesting is, if any of you are following the EdTech space and the disaster that is Byju's and others, you will understand that a number of the interventions in the edtech space are with app models. App models which are largely content-driven models, wherein if you take the curriculum of a particular subject or anything and you make it into modules that can be learned on the phone, interactive learning on the phone, on screens, that is the larger objective of many edtech models. If you look at what they're talking about interactive education learning, it's largely the content presented in a certain way and accessed on the phone and in other screen models. What is very telling here is that they believe that all you need is an initiative to learn, not really so much the school environment. Right? So the system really isn't important. It is the individual motivation and the interest to learn. So you give a needy child, the child does not really need the school, does not really need a fully functioning school. The teacher may not be there, electricity may not be there, public infrastructure may not be there. But if the child genuinely wants to learn, you just give the child a tablet or a phone which they can access, and the material they will learn on their own. Individual, system. Okay, these are very important social contexts of how you're going to situate learning. So for someone like Girish, when he's working in the school system that he is through the Teach for India model, he's actually thinking, how can I make maths more interesting? Can I actually think or design maths learning in certain ways? So a number of the fellows, they have differing motivations with which how they are understanding their engagement with the school system. I'm not trying to make a value judgment here. I'm actually genuinely trying to understand these professionals themselves for how they understand the school system, because those motivations then go on to really see their imprint in policy. I'm not saying that directly in the language of policy, but in the way language is shaped and understood. I use something called, or at least this sort of sociological term called entrepreneurial citizenship. It's from the work of this anthropologist and STS scholar, science and technology studies scholar, Lily Irani. She uses this term entrepreneurial citizenship. It sort of develops on consumer citizenship that Ritti Lukos sort of spoke about of liberalization and the rise of a certain upper middle class segment in the 1990s. So what Irani is saying is that what we often do not think about really is what are the entrepreneurial motivations of individuals working within the development sector? How do they see innovation? And what's interesting is that they see innovations as not a large scale systemic reform, but as small things that can be tweaked and changed, which can feed into a large thing or not. So the idea of reform isn't something big. It is not a big, large scale thing. It's tiny, small scale things. So for example, if a particular site is having, you're not thinking about large scale development models like, okay, you put a dam here, you change the site of irrigation, or you think about smaller scale innovative models. You think of smaller innovative scales. So the scale of entrepreneurial citizenship is more with regard to smaller kind of interventions and models, which may or may not sort of feed into a larger domain. But what I find very interesting here is I'm taking from Lily Irani to really see that the smaller innovations and interests that a number of these fellows develop in many ways also seep into the larger policy space. Now, after they work in Teach for India, where do they go? What do the alumni members do? A number of the alumni members, I showed the web a little bit earlier. They end up working in a number of the most prominent non-profit sector organizations in Delhi, and they're keenly working in education, whether it's education initiatives, CreateNet, Education Alliance, CSF. CSF, of course, is a very, very prominent entity in the space of education. So when they're working here, these individuals also have their own grassroots experience from Teach for India. So when they work in these nonprofit organizations after the fellowship program, there's a deep imprint really on how they're seeing public schooling and how public schooling should improve or change. So they see that the public school system really must embody a lot of private sector ideas and principles if it really wants to change. It must think about outcomes in a certain way. It must think of competition in certain ways. It must be efficient in certain ways. It must give back in certain ways. This is a language that is internally shaping the idea of how you see private principles becoming publicly accountable. Something like best practices. I think this is a term that I think no policy scholar can ignore, right? What do you mean by best practices really? And what's interesting here is that I don't fully unpack the domain of best practices, but what's interesting really is that, you know, what is it that is working at the grassroots level? How does it move into a larger policy mindset or space? So much so that future policies that are made and developed take from that grassroots experience itself. Now, if you look from a lay language, obviously evidence-based policy, what you see at the grassroots should feed into policy, right? But can policy be standardized across the board in a way that I saw this in these segment of schools? So thus it works in the segment of school. So then when I make the policy, it should also be mapped in a way that it will only operate in the way in which it will operate across these schools. Now, why I'm saying this also is that, see, when we talk about outcome-oriented learning, it also has an impact on how the teachers operate in the classroom. So if you're going to start looking at the teachers as solely with the results that they bring, then the teacher starts changing their teaching in the classroom to focus only on teaching that which will have outcomes. What that ultimately means is that, say, if the end result is only on English and maths learning, not so much on how, say, social science or science is taught, then you focus only on these subjects because this is what is going to be outcome oriented. Or how you teach that subject also should be done in the most time constrained way such that it will lead to these outcomes. It's a lot more complicated. So in a classroom where there are first generation learners, none of them perhaps have the fluency of English that, say, those with cultural capital have. When you administer a learning assessment on them primarily in English, the assessment outcome tells you that they are all terrible in English. Then you decide that you will design a learning method such that all of them will become excellent in English. You may or may not have the complete bandwidth of how to teach English to a non-English learning child, but you decide that this is what I'm going to effectively do within the scope of 1 year, such that the next assessment I give, the child should have a higher outcome. Does the child really understand English? Are my interventions really the best way in which the child should learn English? Those deeper pedagogical questions aren't really what is gearing the teaching learning engagement. It is what is the best solution that will give me the outcome that I'm looking for. And in something like teaching learning, it's a very difficult endeavor really to narrow and make outcomes so reductive. I am speaking from the framework of a sociologist. If you ask economists, it is not that easier. For them, the assessment is what matters. What is the end outcome that is coming in the test is what matters. But what is the design of the instrument and what it is capturing is often not really spoken about. Yeah. So I'm also speaking really with the minutiae of what teaching learning impact happens when you start gearing policy in certain ways. My question here is not to say that learning outcomes are not important, but what is the learning outcome that you're looking for is also very, very important. Does your instrument do justice to the individuals that you're testing them on? That is very, very essential. This understanding and impact. Then what are the literacy levels? Oh, they do not know how to add and subtract. You're not really going into the depth, right? You're taking these very disparate things into larger data to say, this is how it is operating across the board. So what I'm also saying is that in sort of expertise and ideas and practices from the grassroots move into ideas of policy where the policy, one prescription norm or one standardization norm hides a lot of the disparities of the system as well. And in that technology of governance, what the data is showing, while it may be true, the approach to which that governance is going to go ahead is again in question. At least I am skeptical really in the technocracies of those governance measures, because the moment you start putting accountability solely on the teacher to produce a certain set of results, you will find that the students are doing strangely extremely well in the classroom. Because if the teacher's performance is linked to the student's performance and the students are doing great, then the teacher is doing great. So it also leads to what has been reported in number of Western democracies, fabrication of test results. You can see it very clearly also in the ways in which test scores are just increasing across the board. You're not really looking deeper into ideas of learning here, but the more idea is that the teacher, and see which teacher presents what outcome, in many ways also hides the discrepancies of the infrastructure of the system. If you're going to start evaluating a KV with a local municipal school, you have to start seeing the sample of the schools as well, right? So I think these discrepancies also need to be taken account as well. So I'll sort of end the discussion here, sort of moves across in many ways from the organization to what it means for governance and policy today. And thank you so much. I'm open to questions, feedback.
Thank you so much, Vidya, for this talk. And we see in this talk, where we look at education, like, in this landscape where we look at education as public good, and it is more increasingly moving towards education as a commodity, which can be bought and sold. Your talk shows us how, public-private models or how different actors are operating in the educational landscape and how they are shaping up the aspirations and what are the limits of these actors. And I think we also see how the neoliberal logic operates in this education or education system with this kind of involvement. So maybe I will open the floor for the Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I can ask about 30 to 40 questions because absolutely I have no idea of the subject. Shameful, but that's the point. Does this Teach for India have a kind of a mission statement? Do they want to carry some kind of a program or to motivate students, to motivate teachers? When I can see issues like I walk into a school from a different state. I worked in IBM, from IIT, last posting over Boston. I come to this municipal school. Teachers and principals can't relate to me. And probably their English fluency probably won't be as much as mine. Do they see me as a savior? Oh, he has come from heaven, now he's going to fix our problems, let us cooperate with him. Or I don't know what kind of understanding this Teach for India program has had with the schools. Whom do they pay? What are the issues of coordination with the teachers? For example, in this very hall, we conducted several bridge programs for university level candidates. We thought we have done a good job, and the candidates also said they thanked us, they still thank us, but we are not really sure what exactly we accomplished in that. So any feedback from not so much students, but parents for the years? I think it's more than 20 years now.
It's been 2009, so you would say 2025. What?
15 years.
Yeah.
But maybe 10 years.
Yeah.
if the more data possibly have.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that.
Should I answer or should I take more
Yeah,
questions?
Today,
Yeah, so thank you so much. I think that's a very important question really to unpack. What does the intervention really do in terms of the existing, disparate hierarchies and the inner sort of class system of the school itself? And where I observed the program operating, there was a lot of discomfort with the Teach for India program. In the segment of schools that I observed, the few segment of schools that I interviewed fellows as well, number of the fellows spoke about how the school principal and the other government teachers often saw them with a lot of distance. They found that they were going to do something in 2 years, leave, then another sort of fellow will come and go. So they saw them as people who just would come and go. And what's interesting also is that the fellows, in many ways, they weren't accountable to the school system. They didn't have any accountability in some ways to the governance of the government system. They didn't have to do administrative work in their classrooms. They didn't have to handle attendance, midday meals. They didn't have to do any of the clerical work that a number of the government teachers do. They had to only focus on teaching English, maths, and the subjects that they were assigned via the organization, and their accountability was their performance to their program manager and their TFI organization. So their accountability to the school principal was only to the level that they maintain decorum and discipline of the students in their classroom. The children should be quiet, well behaved, but not that what is it that the fellow is doing in the classroom. So what's also very interesting here is that pedagogically, what is happening in the space of the classroom wasn't even the concern of the government. So the inner workings of the local municipal school system itself was like, kuch ho raha hai, kuch NGO hai, kuch kaam kar rahe hai. It wasn't really so much. See, and the thing is that where there were some teachers who were curious about what the program was doing, there could have been some aspect of a bridge between interested fellows and interested teachers. I'm sure that those opportunities also shaped up in some schools, but I did not observe those schools, at least in the sample that I saw. In a lot of the schools that I observed, for a number of the government teachers and the principal, their main priority was that these students should be quiet and disciplined, and they need to just do their job. And their job really wasn't as much as, like changing or doing anything radical. Whereas for the Teach for India fellow, this 2-year fellowship meant that they had to do something to show that they're doing something in the classroom. It could be also that their passion and interest in the classroom may have motivated a lot of the parents to see that, nobody seems to be interested in my child, but this fellow seems to be more interested in my child. And the biggest USP here was English medium education. You cannot discount that for a lot of the parents who may not really understand the larger pedagogical nature or consequences of how their children are being taught, but the idea that their child comes back home speaking in phrases of English is a matter of pride for these parents. So there was a lot of disjuncture really in the governance apparatus of the Teach for India program and the government school. The NGO was operating within the government school as a parallel structure. It wasn't really integrated with the existing school teachers or the principal. So there was a clear distance. What's also interesting is that the students who were filtered into the English medium section, they were also relatively the better students. So there are these class differences, right, among students itself. So when the school principal is putting students into the English medium section and the regional language section, obviously the student who's going to be selected into the English medium section is someone who's relatively slightly better. So there's already a class differentiation even in the category of students who are going into the English medium section in the Teach for India local municipal school. So there are differentiation at varied levels.
Kids who badly need these programs are excluded.
Yes.
Hi, thanks for sharing your research. I've read your work in the past as well, and it's very relevant to the conversation happening right now on so many different things in the education space. So I have 3 different questions. One is, what sort of regulatory frameworks have there been after initiatives like this from CSOs, especially in the context of PPPs, have you observed any to mitigate these sort of overreaching initiatives? The second one is translation to policy. Every direction we look, I'm also an education policy researcher, and every direction we look, there's a TFI fellow running it in some way or the other, and alumni networks are extremely strong. So there are a lot of things, whether you're designing a policy at the state level, at the union level, or even just at the district level, in many cases, there's a TFI fellow who's sort of helping design this. Have you mapped this out by any chance to see how this translates to policy, right? The third is how many of them, I've heard Wendy Kopp speak before at different events, and something that she mentions is when she started Teach for America, there was this aspect of not enough teachers in the system, which we have also seen then how that narrative was formed earlier. There's a lot of research on that. But she mentioned that there aren't enough teachers, which is why this fellowship sort of introduces others to entering the system as teachers. And something that they've observed, not just in the US, then in other countries where this system was the Teach for All sort of fellowships were introduced, was that not enough go back to becoming teachers. So are we observing that in India as well, where they go back to, I mean, we also then end up hiring, right? Like as CSOs, we've ended up hiring a lot of TFI fellows in the past. How many of them end up going back to becoming teachers? Is that something that you have looked into in the past? You already answered in some ways the dependencies that the system sort of creates, and then how when you pull out, what the effects of that are. The other question was what sort of challenges did these fellows report they face? Because we have seen a lot of mental health related aspects, children who have lost their lives and how that affects these fellows. Also, in some cases, there are picnics that are conducted, and then it was in the news a few years ago where children lost their lives because of this, that TFI fellows then, sort of led. Also in terms of classroom support, like you mentioned, there are these managers that TFI has for these fellows, but what sort of real support are they able to provide? Because each manager has so many fellows. Any questions? Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I'll take one more question. Yeah.
To speak in Hindi because I feel comfortable over there. Thank you so much. मैम हम एक जो हमारा सब्जेक्ट है ना, इसके लिए न्याय नहीं कर रहे हैं, इंसाफ, डूइंग जस्टिस टू द सब्जेक्ट. हम बार बार कंपेयर करते हैं वेस्ट के साथ. वेस्ट में मैंने डिकेड्स गुजार दिए. वहाँ की जो रिसोर्सेज हैं, इथोस हैं, एसेट्स हैं वर्सेस लाइबिलिटीज, दैट इज स्टूडेंट्स, उसका कोई मुकाबला ही नहीं है. यहाँ तो रिसोर्सेज नहीं है, और रात में 1 लाख बच्चा पैदा हो जाता है. आप उसको देखिएगा कि लाइबिलिटीज जो है मल्टीप्लाई कर रही है फास्टर देन द रिसोर्सेज डेवलपिंग, और सोर्सेज है नहीं. तो इस हालात में उनके साथ कंपेयर करना, वो सब्जेक्ट एक से अपने आप में सब्जेक्ट बन जाता है, वो एक अन्याय की बात है. तो पहले वो नहीं होना चाहिए. अच्छा, दूसरा ये राइट टू एजुकेशन. व्हाट राइट टू एजुकेशन और फ्री एजुकेशन? आई वुड गो लिटिल फर्दर टू से व्हाई ओनली एजुकेशन, व्हाई नॉट फ्री एजुकेशन? एक दूसरा, आप बार बार ये कहते स्टूडेंट्स लिविंग गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स एंड गोइंग फॉर द प्राइवेट स्कूल्स. आपको इसके लिए क्षमा कीजिएगा, मैं गांव की बात कर रहा हूँ, देहात की. बिहार में, यूपी में और भी जगह में जो रिमोट एरियाज है, स्कूल्स हैं, वहाँ फंड्स भी हैं, टीचर भी है, ना कोई पढ़ाता है, ना कोई पेंटिंग करता है, ना कोई कुछ करता है. एक्सपेंडिचर होता है ऑन द पेपर्स, पैसा सब खा जाते हैं. वो स्कूल में भी नहीं आते, टीचर से बच्चों पूछो, साहब 1 हफ्ता हो गया नहीं आए हैं. दिस हमारे इथोस ही नहीं है. तो हम किसी सिचुएशन को अच्छा, एक सबसे बड़ी शिकायत मुझे आपसे ये है, हम बार बार कहते हैं एंथ्रोपोलॉजी को लाओ, हम जो क्या नाम, ये दूसरे लोगों को लाओ, जो वॉलंटियर्स आए, दूसरे लोग आए जो हेल्प करें, सोसाइटी को हेल्प करो. गवर्नमेंट काहे के लिए? गवर्नमेंट के पास पैसा है, फ्री बीज में अरबों रुपया दे रहे हैं. आप फ्री बीज का अंदाजा लगाइए. हर पार्टी प्रॉमिस कर दिया है, इट इज ऑन रिकॉर्ड, और मैं सब इसको लिए विटनेस हूँ, आप भी विटनेस हैं, कि हर पार्टी ने अरबों रुपया फ्री बीज में दे दिया. क्या ये एजुकेशन में नहीं दिया जा सकता? क्या बच्चों का कोई ध्यान नहीं? इनको सिस्टम, हमारी गवर्नमेंट, दिल्ली गवर्नमेंट स्कैंडिनेविया में जाती है, वहाँ स्कूल सिस्टम पढ़ती है. आपको पता, मैं स्कैंडिनेविया में भी रहा हूँ. तो स्कैंडिनेविया स्कूल सिस्टम, कितनी रिसोर्सेज है उनकी? पॉपुलेशन है ही नहीं, पॉपुलेशन तो है ही नहीं, बच्चे तो राजा हैं वहाँ पर. आप वहाँ पढ़ने गए हैं, आप यहाँ अपनी झुग्गी झोंपड़ियों में जाके देखो क्या हाल है. आप वहाँ क्यों जाते हो? यहाँ काम करो ना, यहाँ काम करो जो करना है. तो हम यहाँ ग्राउंड रियलिटी के ऊपर नहीं करते. जहां हमारे इथोस ही वीक हैं। हमें ये चीज को भूल जाना चाहिए कि कोई एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट हमारी एजुकेशन सिस्टम को संभालेगा। हमें पॉलिटिशियन जो हैं, कट क्रॉस द पार्टीज, आई एम नॉट फॉर एनी पार्टी, टेल यू द ट्रुथ,
Excuse me.
इन लोगों को पकड़ के हमें सुधारना होगा कि तुम सिस्टम को चलाओ, तुम काहे के लिए वहां बिठाए गए हो, क्यों एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट आए, क्यों दूसरे लोग आए, क्यों स्कैंडिनेविया में जाते हो, क्यों यूएस में जाते हो?
Sir,
प्रॉब्लम तो यहाँ है। आई एम सॉरी मैम, थैंक यू।
Thank you. A lot of very necessary and large questions have been asked. I shall do my best to answer as much as possible. I'll start with the questions that you've posed about the regulatory sort of infrastructure that exists around these PPP models. So what was interesting really, when we're talking about regulation here is how do we define the fellow in the PPP model and in the scope of the intervention? So what is interesting is that the fellows aren't called teachers. They are referred to as teaching resources if you go into the MOU. It is also very carefully framed in that way because they can't be called teachers, because then it sort of interferes with the RTE language of how the teacher is defined, which requires the teacher to have certain formal qualifications. So in the scope of the definition of the fellow itself and the nature of their intervention, they are defined as teaching resources, but their operation in the scope of the program is actually as a full-fledged teacher in the classroom. Okay, so this is also an important point here because it is primarily on this definition that they cannot work in the better of government schools like KVs, etc. You will not find TFI fellows in KVs and all of that, right? The other thing also is when we're talking about regulatory infrastructure, if you compare TFI with other teach for models, the operation and integration of the model in different countries, of course, differs based on the particular socio context and requirements of that particular system. Like I said, in the American model, what is very important is that the fellow also get an alternative teaching certification. So there is some sort of idea that teaching is not a loose profession. There has to be some professional accountability mechanism through an ATC. Now, there can be numerous arguments about the quality and the standard of an alternative teaching certification, no doubt. I'm not going into that discussion here and I'm keeping it brief, but the idea that there is a professional accountability to the ambit of teaching exists in the Teach for America model, which doesn't exist in, say, the Teach for India model. So regulatory framework, so to say, for something like TFI are actually quite weak. They're quite weak. And when they're weak, it also means that the accountability is weak. Because primarily, if the TFI person is responsible for something going wrong in that classroom, it is not the TFI fellow who is responsible, but the school principal, which is why a lot of important administration work is not given to the TFI fellow. It is very important really because the buck stops with the school principal. It does not stop at the TFI fellow. So it really opens up. There's a lot of looseness really in terms of accountability and regulatory infrastructure when we're looking at how NGOs operate in a government, not government, public space really. And what do we mean by public-private partnerships here? Because if they're operating in the scope of a public good space, then there has to be accountability also framed. So the accountability framing here for the TFI fellow is very, very weak, exceedingly weak. I think historically, if we look at the emergence of the Teach for America model vis-a-vis the Teach for India model, they emerged at very, very differing time frames as well. And they answer very different sort of socio-economic and historical questions at those particular junctures. So in the late 80s, when Teach for America emerged, you see a very high attrition in the school system. You don't see teachers anywhere. And the public schooling system in the US clearly is highly overburdened. Teaching is really not the profession that many people are entering. So it is at that attrition that you have Wendy Kopp, who is a Yale University alumni, designed something like the Teach for America model, where she believes that teaching can be made better if you have passionate individuals in that space. So if you look at the initial design of the Teach for America model, it's actually very centered towards teaching learning. It draws from an older pedagogical model where the aim is really to improve teaching learning. But slowly over the course of, say, the decades of the model, it's moved to a leadership model, which then it means the role of the fellow is beyond the classroom. It is in the space of policy. The origin of the TFI model in the Indian context is already in the leadership space. It begins with the leadership space. It is not interested in teaching learning. So the scope of when it comes about itself is to create good leaders, is to create good managers. What's interesting is that these fellows come from certain backgrounds and spaces where they have very good managerial skills. They have very good professional communication skills. They know what to speak of the way they are working, and they operate as very good conduits to policymakers, bureaucrats who want data, who want to be able to. So when you know that language and you can present that language very well, then you are a very good conduit to that system. So in many ways, I am not being critical in that way that, oh, the TFI model is good or bad. I'm not making moral judgments here, but I'm speaking really also to the larger non-profit sector that has changed so much that you see a certain segment of very, very management-oriented professionals now becoming a key part of the schooling system. You see also a lot of managerial work taking from, say, the new public management discourse being outsourced to private actors who will then provide you insights into how the public system should become better, right? So attrition at one point in time was the answer for Teach for America. The scope of the poor learning system in India is being answered through leadership and management skills. So even the vision of Teach for India in the beginning itself is to go beyond the classroom. About returning back to the schooling system as to whether they should come back to work as teachers, a number of them do not actually have the aspiration to come back to work as teachers. See, here there are a lot of drawbacks really in the way in which they see themselves also going back to a system that doesn't pay. School teaching specifically, is not the most well-paid job. Of course, you have government school teachers who are in secure positions and who get reasonably decent salaries, etc. But primarily, school teaching is not an aspirational upper middle class vocation anymore. And school teaching itself is not really on the radar of many of these individuals. So you see school teaching itself not being the space where many of them want to go back. A few of them, of course, do go and take their B.Ed degrees and do end up working in alternative schools or some kinds of private schools. A few of them do go back into teaching, but the larger aim of the model is not to really interesting, and it's not been explored enough. At least I haven't explored it enough in my work, although it does come out in many ways, is that the TFI fellow in many ways is also ill-equipped and overwhelmed with seeing the system before them. They themselves do not know what it means to engage with those who are coming from these backgrounds. They themselves do not know what to make out of the fact that, you know, your interventions and the passion and effort that you're putting in may not have the results that you hope, because there are larger structural material realities that may not really be able to answer the passion and, you know, input that you're putting in. Like I remember a fellow telling me that he was very heartbroken when one of his best students decided to stop coming to his class regularly because he needed to also work with his father. So the fact that, you know, he'll have to continue working outside the classroom to support his family vis-a-vis also studying in the classroom was something that he found very heartbreaking, but it also was his first reality check with the fact that he never had to work when he was studying. It brings into the fact that child labor is a reality in the country, right? I mean, despite a number of regulations coming into play, with regard to also how you see the NEP fleshing itself out in the way in which, say, philanthropy or philanthropic actors are defined, you actually see a lot more looseness. I won't say, like, I don't want to say that it's narrow. It's a lot more loose and open-ended to bring a lot more actors into the space of volunteering rather than the space of accountability. Or even if you do bring in volunteers, what does it mean for accountability? Because at the end of the day, you're teaching other people's children. And I use that very consciously. It's also the title of a book that is used in the Teach for America context, where a scholar had used this as her title of her thesis, teaching other people's children. It's a clear distinction of who you see yourself as and who you're teaching and engaging with. Yeah, there's of course a lot with the RTE and all, but I can answer it, or I can also go ahead to other questions. Like what Sir is speaking, I think resonates with a lot of the important dilemmas that one is talking about, that what models are we emulating? We're looking at the West for certain models, and like you have rightly said, when we're looking at Scandinavian countries, we're not really fully contextualizing the position of the school teacher there. In countries such as Finland, etc., teaching is heavily professionalized and revered. So you can't really compare what teaching means in that space to how teachers are being embodied here or thought of here. So of course, it's easy to show that one can go to Scandinavian countries and learn from their models, but we also need to understand that those models are rooted in particular social contexts. And teaching is a very different sort of ball game there in those spaces, with regard to how teachers are trained, with regard to how teachers enter the system, and the resources that are available. All of that, of course, holds true.
Sorry, ma'am, just one word. Sorry, ma'am, just one. Ma'am, you have not said a word, and it is very important in terms of education or anywhere. I'm talking about Indian environment, not taking the universe or the world as there. हमारे लिए यहाँ पर यूनिफॉर्म एजुकेशन को ऊपर को बात करने को तैयार नहीं है. हर कोई अपनी दुकान खोल के बैठा है. कोई ये पढ़ा रहा है, कोई वो पढ़ा रहा है, कोई इस प्रोविंस में ये पढ़ा रहा है और उस प्रोविंस में कोई मुसलमान और पढ़ा रहा है, हिंदू और पढ़ा रहा है, प्रांत. तो नेशनल क्राइटेरिया क्या है? हमारा एजुकेशन सिस्टम जो है, हम यूनिफॉर्म एजुकेशन सिस्टम क्यों नहीं ला सकते यहाँ पर? क्या हमारा नेशन बिल्ड करेंगे? इस तरह हमारा नेशन बिल्ड होगा अगर हम बच्चों को कर देंगे, बच्चों को बांट देंगे.
I know you have said your piece, but it's also important to know कि कई देशों में जो कि बड़े हैं, जैसे कि आप अगर अमेरिका को देखें, वहां पे न तो स्टेट लेकिन हर एक स्कूल बोर्ड की अलग अलग सिस्टम है, करिकुलम है. डाइवर्सिटी अलग होना अपने में कोई खराब या अच्छी बात नहीं, क्योंकि हर करिकुलम, हर बोर्ड, हर सिस्टम अपने तरह से जो वहां के लोग हैं उनकी जो जरूरतें हैं उसको देख के बनाई जानी चाहिए. बनती है कि नहीं बनती है वो अलग बात, लेकिन ये बात नहीं है कि वन इंडिया वन करिकुलम हमारी एजुकेशन सिस्टम को बहुत ज्यादा अच्छी बनाए. वो दो अलग अलग प्रश्न है जो कि देखनी चाहिए. अब Vidya, if I can bring you back a little bit to the city in three ways. One, first, is there an issue between, do you have any thoughts on Mumbai and Delhi in terms of the two kinds of structures? Second, I'm struck by what you just said about the position of the teacher in the future, right? And in a sense, here I see, I'm generalizing at very broad levels here, but if I look at the rural and the urban, one, I see the position of a teacher even today in rural to be have significant social status, as opposed to what you would have in the urban. That's one framing. You can sort of think through it and see whether you agree and how it does. And secondly, however, in the urban, the pool of the quality of teachers from which you're drawing quality of teachers is also much broader and deeper. So the average public school teacher is likely to have, to be quote unquote, a better qualified teacher than the average public school teacher in the rural in that sense. So there is intrinsic quality and there is social positionality, and the two are sort of, in my mind, moving in different areas. Third is, if you have any thoughts about the interaction of, so there is this, as you said, an external intervention that comes into the school system. It sort of is a teaching intervention, but it also sort of is an intervention that opens up a world that is not usually accessible to this particular group of students, precisely because they're coming from very different kind of backgrounds. Is that in your work, did you just mentioned this, person being disappointed about that structure coming through, but in your interaction, did you work also with the students? Did you have a sense of what that sort of exposure to the broader world, what difference it made? And I'm asking this also in the urban context because for a child who is in a Delhi school, that exposure can actually open up possibilities precisely because of where the person is located, versus if this person was in Jumritalaya. And to what extent does that, did you see any of that happening in the sense where, and to that extent, you mentioned 8 places where TFI is involved in, that just from the way of the intervention that took place, if you did have TFI interventions in rural schools, would you care to speculate about how that effect might be? Positive, negative, sideways, either ways? I don't know, whichever way you're looking at.
Lot to think through, and I shall answer thinking through and processing a lot of the questions that you've posed. In terms of the demographic differences between Bombay and Delhi, like I noted, I didn't observe schools in Bombay. So in the sense, I didn't see the nature of the program operating in Bombay schools. I looked at Bombay primarily as the site to be able to reconstruct the narrative of how did the program come into picture and what were the sort of policy measures, policy landscape within which this program originated. The site where I actually observed the program were a segment of the TFI schools operating again in South Delhi, yes. But what's also interesting, I think this is a method that I did not speak about, but I should mention, is that I actually had a very difficult time entering and observing Teach for India and gaining access to Teach for India in the government schooling system. In fact, I had to use RTI, the right to information, extensively to even understand the scale of the intervention across East Delhi, North Delhi, South Delhi. And what's also interesting is that demographically, TFI operates in some of the most better public infrastructure oriented government schools in South Delhi. It has a little space in North Delhi, NDMC, and a little in East Delhi. But the best schools that the fellows operate in are in a lot of older government schools which have very good public infrastructure in the scope of the city of Delhi. So even in terms of, say, when we're talking about, say, like big distinctions between I mean, in a way, yes, the pool of teachers who come, pool of government teachers who are perhaps applying to work in the segment of government schools via the teacher eligibility tests, etc., and the other interventions in the government schooling system are better. Number of the school teachers themselves are on contract. So the government teachers itself who are working in the schools that I saw, they themselves are operating as guest teachers and in 1-year contract. So you're seeing a heavy contractualization itself of teachers who are relatively of better quality working in urban government schools itself. When we're looking at the rural government school teacher over here, broadly, if I'm speaking about here, see, I think teaching as a vocation is culturally revered. So, in the sense that there is a high status attached to the teacher as someone to be respected, but it isn't a socio-economically very high profile profession. And even today, you will see that if you're actually this is seen in a number of studies looking at teacher identity and teacher profession, looking at teacher motivation. If you ask teachers why did they enter the profession, you will see that school teaching is the last thing that they want to be. A number of teachers are working as school teachers and then applying for a number of other government jobs. They're writing government tests all the time so that they can leave this and move into another government job. And most teachers are working in a range of low income private schools. So the next step is either they get into a permanent government job or they get into the bank or clerical government job. So even those who are in the teaching profession per se, their primary interest is not really to be working as a teacher. So teaching is very culturally revered in the Indian society, no doubt, but socio-economically the status is pretty low. And when we say that the teacher has a high status, so say, the teacher is also an important contact or an important person who can guide you towards other resources and towards other trajectories that are possible. So in a rural context where there may not be many educated people, the teacher can be a person who can guide perhaps interested students to certain opportunities, no doubt. So in that way, in that relative position, the teacher may be a valuable individual or a site to be seen as, you know, a good contact or a good. But even today, if you look at a number of studies around students and their motivations in the context, education is not really now seen as the best site really to be able to make your mark. You are seeing education also in many ways as something that should lead you to be more economically secure. So to see whether these students will actually think about studying more and have professional mobility through education is still a very dicey thing, really, because a lot of students see economic security as a very, very important aspect. So, I mean, I'm again like when I'm making this observation, I'm also talking from the work of, say, scholars such as Craig Jeffrey. When he's talking about, say, in Time Pass, his very, very like seminal book, he's talking about the fact that the idea that education should lead to social mobility is not necessarily true. There are highly educated individuals who are also in many ways operating, or they're waiting in some ways for a certain opportunity to come by, and education hasn't necessarily translated into the kind of professional mobility that they hoped for. So there are a lot of educated unemployment, high number of educated unemployment. So even the idea that, you know, if I'm going to just stick on, I'm going to do, you know, my education well, I'll finish schooling, then I will get a degree, then I will do my master's, you know, that traditional trajectory no longer holds very true. It no longer holds very true because there is immense insecurity and precarity attached with the fact that your education may not necessarily translate into a job. That aspiration and education and employment connection is deeply fractured today. So, I mean, that's one thing that I would like to note here. In terms of, say, cultural capital, that's an important question, really, because the Teach for India Fellow in that capacity is an important site of cultural capital. So, in the sites of the classroom where that fellow works, the few students and who get associated with the fellow does open up a lot of opportunities for those individual students. So I know of fellows who continue to keep in touch with the students that they taught, helping pay for a number of opportunities that these students want in their life, opening up their cultural horizon, taking them to competitions and things as such. they got introduced to something like, say, Maths Olympiad, and if they were good in maths. So no doubt that the fellow does bring a certain set of cultural capital to the classroom, and the students who get associated with a well-meaning fellow do have these opportunities out for them. I think what's also important is to be able to see these interventions within the systemic capacity of the larger scope of the schooling system as well. Uh, does this increase or exacerbate disparity in an already stratified school system? How do we make sense of this? Often at times when I've presented this work and I've had fellows in the classroom, many of them come to me and say, like, what you said hit me at a certain level, but like, we also want to do good. We also, like, there was a certain guilt factor attached to what they needed to also explain of themselves. And honestly, I did understand that, which is why I also feel it's important that when I'm speaking of the fellows, I'm not trying to make a moral judgment here on the work, but on really trying to look at them as elite professionals who are becoming very important movers and shakers in the policy space today. And when I'm saying movers and shakers, I'm not saying that this is the person who's going to be writing the policy, but most definitely these are the fellows who are feeding into the policy for sure.
Can we take some online questions?
Oh,
for you,
okay.
So first we'll do that. There's one question for you which I don't quite understand, but the question is from an anonymous participant. Do you think it is detrimental for the ecosystem? These interventions are meant for to provide support, which is a different, maybe lower standard than what is now.
Okay.
Okay. And then there's a second question, which is kind of asking that the reach of TFI is restricted, as you said, in 8 cities. So this person is asking, is it possible? How do you increase this? Is it possible to increase the reach of TFIs in other cities where maybe English may not be like that spoken or that well known to larger section? So that's the second question, and there's a third question from Bhavna Malhotra. And the question is, I come from a background of masters in education. I want to ask that, is there any study on how can 3-4 weeks of training in models like TFI compared to the pedagogical depth that relevant teached education programs bring? The term relevant here refers to the institutions where the stakeholders are also related to policy spaces.
Okay.
And there's a fourth question which is quite long, so you can respond to me.
So I haven't understood the first
First one,
question,
yeah.
so I won't unfortunately
sure.
be able to respond to that. Now, the scope of the intervention, I think it also connects to one of the questions that Partha also spoke about. What if we had more TFI fellows in the rural spaces? What's interesting is when I was piecing together the managerial sort of organizational setup of the program, it's interesting to note that the fellows themselves are pretty urban and middle class themselves. They wanted to stay within the cities. They did not want to sort of take any intervention beyond the scope. Many of them themselves were not conversant in regional languages. So a few of them, whoever were very interested, went ahead and started some kind of 1 or 2 alternative schools in certain places by themselves. But these were just 1 or 2 individuals. But the bulk of them remained within the urban cities that they were, where the city is, 8 cities, because they themselves did not see themselves as working beyond the urban confines that they were familiar with. And this is radically different from the Teach for America model. And what's also important here is the socio-economic context and the privilege of the fellow, that they did not want to see themselves beyond the scope of the 8 cities that they were working in. And like has been more, restriction is not something that's imposed. It's something that's also very speaking and very telling of the socio-cultural composition of the organization and the individuals themselves. With regard to the second question, I think I'll answer what I have understood. There isn't, to my knowledge so far, any in-depth understanding in the Indian context, that is of the Teach for India model, on how do we ascertain or compare the TFI fellow who has only 3 or 4 weeks of training versus someone who has a B.Ed and an M.Ed. I think that's an important thing to really compare and see. What does it mean to have professional education credentials, teacher training, teacher education credentials vis-a-vis someone from a TFI 3 to 4 week training model? In the American context, there are numerous studies really comparing those who come from professional teacher education backgrounds and those who are coming from TFA routes, ATC, alternative teaching certification routes. What is the impact on, say, learning, etc.? So there are a number of studies in that context. Of course, there are divergent aspects in the sense that depending on the sampling, depending on the focus of how those studies have been framed, there have been studies indicating how long-term teachers who are training to be within the system are much more better, well-equipped to know that their failures that they're having are not major life setbacks, that they are learning experiences that help them become stronger for them to keep working within the system. Because teaching is a very, very not just physically strenuous, but emotionally very, very strenuous job. So for you to last within the system, it means that you also have to start becoming, you have to start becoming in many ways also your armor and your guard also has to become stronger, because it's very, very difficult to work within a system which has less resources and is not operating efficiently in the way in which you assume it to be.
There are 2 more questions. Can we?
Just one or two factual questions. This MOU is to be signed between the school and the what is it called, TFA, or with the government of state government, or what? What is that?
It's signed between the TFI NGO organization and the respective municipal corporation, because the schools that they operate in are under the municipal corporation, whether it's, when I did it at that time, it was trifurcated. So East Delhi, South Delhi,
Okay.
NDMC.
And second is which class these TFA fellows teach?
So the schools that I observed in Delhi, they were teaching from class 1 to class 5. By the end of my field work, the fellows had entered up to class 6 and class 7.
Okay. And what is the once they take up a school, the TFA takes up a school, do they take up the entire teaching faculty, or they take just 1 or 2, or what is the component of their teaching after they take over?
So, sir, for example, in a municipal corporation school, there are, say, classes from 1 to 5. So class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, class 5.
Complete all subjects.
All here in primary school, you do not have subjects like, say, history, geography and all. You have something called social studies, you have English, and you have language. So till your primary schooling, this is how subject is divided. Then when you enter 6, 7, 8, 9, subjects also become more specialized. So in class 1 to class 5, where they are studying, each section, say class 1 will have a regional language section and an English medium section. In the English medium section, there will be a TFI fellow. So if there are 5 sort of grades in a primary school, there will be 5 TFI fellows in the English medium section of the respective grade school. So grade 1 will have 1 TFI fellow, grade 2 will have 1 TFI fellow, and so on. So that's how it.
And what is the payment to these TFI fellows?
They get a stipend, which is from the TFI organization itself. The
Okay.
stipend at that time when I did my field work, which is between 2014 to 2017, they got something like, I think, 14,000 per month plus 8,000 for HRA or something like that, depending on the city that they were in. These are again rough details that are coming to my mind and I'm noting to you, but that was how the stipend structure was roughly divided.
Okay, thank you.
Will you just say that for the English medium,
Yeah.
the only teacher the student has was the TFI fellow, or the TFI fellow supplemented a government school teacher?
So in the English medium section, the TFI fellow taught English, maths, and the social science subject, which was to be taught in the regional language. And of course, the regional language itself, whether it's Hindi, Punjabi, or Urdu, Delhi schools, the language subjects and the respective social studies subject was taught by the government teacher. But the English based subjects were taught by the TFI fellow, the whole course. And the idea was that the medium of instruction would be English. So this is also a very complicated thing, because one must understand that in schools where the children are coming from multiple language backgrounds, where English is not the primary language, teaching is often done in what is called the translation mode. So you are teaching you may be teaching English via Hindi, right? So in the institution, the making TFI in the English medium section was also to in some way say that now all the English will be the primary mode in which these subjects will be taught as well. But what happened was the fellow realized that the fellow also had to do translation mode of teaching, which a number of government teachers were already doing and continue to do so.
But how is it different from the PPP model?
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't understand.
PPP model, it's public-private participation model.
So it is a PPP model. So in the sense that the TFI is a private party, it is operating in government schools. So in that way, it's a PPP model. Have I missed any question? I'm sorry.
Two more questions.
Yeah,
which
two.
will take.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for the talk. Pardon my ignorance, I'm running off of imaginations here. So for your point on edtech platforms and their larger idea that there will be technology solutions which bring education onto the screen, the imagination that I had was like had a sense of empowerment to it, in the sense that if you don't have good resources in rural places, this is the way in which things can get better. And every now and then we hear in the news, child crack JE just learning from YouTube or an app or something. And it seems to be sort of a hopeful story. So if there is a value judgment that is negative in this regard, then what would be that judgment and why? That would be my question.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
My question is different, but I can add on. One is, I'm very curious about these fellows, teacher fellows. And I was surprised to learn that these are people, volunteers, who do not have aspiration to be teachers. So it's not like they are coming here as an experiment, learning, feeling, and seeing whether they want to teach or not. So what is the motivation of these fellows to come as teaching fellows? Is honorarium, whatever they're getting, a small honorarium, the objective while they're not employed, or is it something else? So what is the motivation? My second question is much broader, and I'm more curious. Is this teaching fellow program only linked to school-based teaching or also non-school-based teaching? Because I vaguely remember we were talking about this institution called Udayan Care that I was associated with because I was supporting a couple of children there. And a friend of mine and her husband also joined this Teach India program, and they started teaching children of this institution as tutors. So, and they were doing it voluntarily, not paid. So that is totally outside the school system. So they were going, husband was teaching maths and wife was teaching English, and they were also teaching Teach from India program. So what kind of stream that kind of non-school teaching comes under?
Thank you. So, yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so the edtech thing, right now in the Indian landscape, the silver bullet, I mean, everybody wants to be able to crack edtech. Now the problem, however, is if I'm taking this tangent, but I will come back to your question, and I hope to at least offer some insights into it, even if I can't fully answer it, is that if you look at the Byju's model, they thought that they had really sort of, cracked the model. But over the course of COVID and the high, sort of school learning deficit that was coming through, Byju's, apart from the financial sort of setback and disasters and inner sort of crumbling of the model, they started actually investing in Aakash and brick and mortar classrooms. So they started seeing that, they had to transition into the regular face-to-face classrooms and start doing coaching in that model rather than do and stick only to the online platform. So somewhere in this entire discourse, there is also a relearning and an unlearning within edtech partners and edtech innovators, entrepreneurs, edupreneurs, the entire sort of gamut of people often coming in many ways from a range of, say, management and IT professionals wanting to crack this bullet, is that they feel that somehow if we give a well-meaning, well-interested student the resources, they will be able to learn and do well. I think what EdTech is really good at is being able to give an interested and a highly curious student the various ways to be able to learn outside the classroom in innovative ways. I think there is a scope really to be able to direct in that way. But if you actually look internally at the pedagogically and the interactive models of these edtech platforms, very few of them actually are geared towards learning innovatively. Some of them really do a good job, which is why, I mean, you've heard of the success stories of some of them, but it's also very interesting really to see what these models give well-meaning students. But the objective here or the larger vision is that all students are well-meaning students, are interested and curious students. As a teacher, if you're looking in a classroom and you can just see the whole bell curve model, in a class of 30 students, the percentage of students who are going to be in the top spectrum are only going to be 4 or 5. The larger is the average, and then there are going to be those who are not interested at all. So a lot of the edtech models may at the end of the day do very well for the already like interested sort of learner in some ways. But the larger vision of the edtech is that everyone will be this interested learner, and hence this edtech model will help everyone become an interested learner. But if you go into the actual social dimensions of learning, we learn not individually, but also from each other and within the scope of a classroom. The role of the teacher is not just a content giver or a person who's just reading a script. It is also in many ways to engage learning, which if you look at COVID data, a lot of the deficit of learning is also the fact that social learning has taken a huge hit, right? So in many ways, I think we really need to be able to unpack the edtech model itself and what they're trying to focus on and do. So I don't believe that edtech is a bad thing. I do think that there are a lot of well-meaning aspects. See, there have been very interesting edtech models that have done wonders to abstract subjects like maths and physics. To be able to visually, and a lot of teachers have benefited from the aids that these edtech platforms bring to the classroom. But somewhere the edtech app cannot be anti-teacher. It has to be in some ways also understand what the teacher and the learning scope has to be within the engagement. I think a lot of apps come with the assumption that the teacher is non-existent and the child is the sole teacher, sole learner, and the child will learn. I think that is where I think the learning of the edtech platform has to change. There are also now, it's very important to understand that edtech, people who are entering edtech are also entering with the idea that they can monetize the model. So if you're going to start monetizing the model, then you are starting to then say that, okay, I can provide you prep for so-and-so test. And if you take my prep, then you will definitely crack IIT, you will crack this test, you will crack that test. So you are having a lot of these prepping models as well, coach prep models. You may have been following the news on FitGE closing its centers in many parts of the city. And one of the big reasons for that is that teachers haven't been paid, right? So I think somewhere we must also understand that as we are engaging with edtech models, a number of the edtech models are also coaching prep models. They want to be able to monetize the model in some way. And once you start monetizing, and once you have who's going to pay for the model, then you start operating within particular class segments, right? So I think that's something to think about. With regard to ma'am's questions, with regard, like what are the motivations? I think I started itself with your question, and I was a master's student when I got interested in this, is I was so curious. Why would you leave a job which has a, conventional route, you would imagine that you've done it right. You've studied and now you're working and that's your pathway. So why do you now want, and I think while this isn't the focus of my paper, but it's very interesting that increasingly a number of those who are in these high pressure, conventional, well corporate jobs are also very, very alienated from the work that they're doing, despite all the discussions on 70-hour work weeks. I mean, there's a lot of alienation that a number of these professionals face in the space of their work, and they feel that they need to be able to have some kind of social connection. And they feel that their way of giving back in many ways is also to be able to work with those who don't have what they have. They may not understand the depth of, like why they don't have what they have, but they feel that if they can give back in these ways, then they're at least being able to understand the social. It's an entry into the social sector. Like for a number of them, they also felt that long term, they don't want to do this high pressure corporate job. And this is also very important to understand that a number of corporate companies now have CSR wings. So for many of them, they want to be able to transition into the CSR space, where they feel that they can be the CSR foundation vision of the corporate company as well, right? So it is these pathways also that seem exciting and interesting for these individuals. About the second question, it's Teach for India, like the CEO, Shaheen Mistry, when she started Akanksha Foundation, was primarily an out-of-school model. It was primarily an out-of-school model. So it was what we are calling remedial teaching thing. It was primarily a remedial model that then becomes a school-based model. And a number of these fellows do work in whatever capacity that they can outside the school as well, because they feel that the school isn't doing enough or that teaching isn't enough. And they want to be able to spend or give more time to support these children outside the school in remedial spaces as well. Because for a number of these children, their parents are also not educated. So a lot of the support that, say, parents give children within the scope of the home, you can learn in the school, but then the mother will take over the task of teaching, learning in the house, and the discipline in the house is lacking for a number of these children. So which is why you will see that tuition actually increases amongst not just the privileged, but it is an increasing phenomenon amongst underprivileged. Yeah. So I think
That part is discontinued now, out of school teaching part.
No, it's not discontinued. They can still teach outside the school. So unlike say school teachers where there are formal rules speaking about, tuition and not tuition and things like that, that gray area doesn't exist for the fellow. They can teach within the scope of the formal school and do remedial teaching as well outside the school.
No, but can a TFI fellow do only remedial teaching?
Only remedial teaching, I don't think that they would. I'm not sure. I have not observed only remedial teaching because they have responsibilities. They are managed by a program manager who checks on them. So I don't think that in the scope of their 2 years, they can only do remedial teaching. Remedial teaching is something that they do beyond the scope, beyond, over and above. They feel that, they can give more. They have the bandwidth to do that. Maybe there are interested students in their classroom who they feel will benefit more with remedial teaching. So that's also there. So I think those are, more individual fellows opting for also doing remedial learning outside the classroom. They weren't fellows, and so then they're just doing it in their own capacity. Then that anyone can do. Okay, I'm not familiar then by this. I'm not. I'm assuming that they're working both as fellows and as remedial teachers. Then I'm not sure. I'm not sure about this. Yeah, so I'm not sure then about this. Yeah.
Whether we have just two small questions online.
Okay.
Just one question which is just asking you, do you think as an intervention, it helps the students that are taught? That's the first question. And the second question, I think, by Nirved, and he's asking about the experiences of the fellows. What happens to them post fellowship? So what kind of experiences they are taking with them, regardless of after teaching for the program, wherever they work, what kind of experiences they are taking, so something in that context.
Okay.
Yeah, when you answered this final question, could you just elaborate a little bit more on examples that you might have where of this, you've spoken about it throughout your talk about the link to policy and structures in that area. So examples where, if you know any, where they've actually sort of engaged in those kinds of spaces, that would be interesting.
So the first question, I think was, could you just repeat it? I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Do you think this intervention helps the students who are taught?
Like, I don't know, to be honest, to be able to give such a large answer as to whether they help the students that they're taught. I would say that, like definitely the intervention and the few fellows, their engagement with the students, it has benefited in the way in which the opportunities that these fellows bring to limited students in the individual capacities that they have been able to manage. So when you're saying whether they're a good intervention or not, automatically there's a reference point to say that have these students done comparatively better than other students who've been taught by a government teacher? I haven't exactly done that kind of a comparative study to be able to speak in that lens. Do I know in the 10 or 11 schools that I observed and I engaged with the fellows, where are these students now to say constructively, longitudinally, that these students who were in TFI classrooms are now doing X, Y, and Z? I haven't done that long-term longitudinal study to be able to make that kind of a statement. But I would say that definitely in their individual capacities, the few motivated fellows have opened up what I would say sociologically cultural capital for a number of individual students. And they have supported some individual well-meaning students up to a certain level. So in that way, at that level, perhaps they have done some good. The next question was, I think, yeah, experiences of the fellows. See, again, it's been very divergent experiences of the fellows. A number of them for the first time realized that, you needed some kind of, see, what was the kind of training that they were put through, the 3 or 4 week. It's just basically, if you look at the blueprint of that model, that blueprint of the model I pieced together through a lot of interviews with the fellows. And you see the blueprint of the model as something that gives them classroom management skills, but it isn't really preparing them to know what is the social composition of the classroom. How do you feel when the child behaves in a certain way? Is there a psychological dimension to how you must engage with children of a certain age? Do children have differing emotional quotients and learning development? These are very important questions in traditional teacher education. These aren't the questions really that the fellows engage with. So when you put them into a sea that they're not familiar with, there's a lot of overwhelming feelings that these fellows have, because they're just evaluating themselves in the space that, am I going to be a good teacher, without really understanding what a teacher is. They are mapping their own frame of a teacher within the scope of the 2 years. And there are a range of feelings here, because it's overwhelming in some ways, because they feel that they've not been able to do enough individually in that limited capacity, without really understanding fully that they are a speck in the ocean. I mean, you can't change the disparity of a school system. You can be extremely passionate and you can make a difference to a couple of students, yes. But to evaluate yourself against so many students and say that you've made this big impact on the system, which is what the program manager maps you with, is a very difficult endeavor. So you have fellows with overwhelming feelings of whether it's success, whether it's failure, whether it is even the idea that, maybe after this engagement, what is also interesting is that some fellows go on to do a master's in education. And some of them feel that, when they enter the master's in education classroom, there's a lot of grassroots experience that they have that they can then put into perspective. So there are those trajectories as well amongst fellows where they move into masters in education, not necessarily with the lens of going back into teaching, but maybe to put their experiences into perspective. And a lot of the time, even when the program manager is working with the fellow, the program manager actually doesn't really have solutions to what the fellow is coping with in the classroom. It's a difficult sort of exercise, really. With regard to the policy question, I think I'm piecing together some of the experiences of the fellows and the alumni members in the non-profit organizations that they went into, and how these non-profit organizations have a close linkage with how Aam Aadmi Party was working. My data is very, again, centered between, say, 2014 to 2016 max. I haven't followed this up after my PhD, so I can't really comment on more aspects right now. But I would say that, see, one of the big changes that something like TFI did was you'll see a number of those alumni members in very prominent non-profit organizations that are at the center of making or pushing through aspects on learning outcomes. You'll see educational initiatives, which is a huge part. You'll see them working with Central Square Foundation. You'll also see something like what I was mentioning called the Change Makers Fellowship. If you look at the inner dynamics of the Changemakers Fellowship, it's a blueprint of the Teach for India program. So that's an absolute sort of thing that the Delhi government makes, saying that, do you want to be a change maker? And you can be a professional, you can come and work in any level of the administrative capacity of the Delhi government. You can work in the school, you can work in the DOE office, you can work in various capacities for 2 years. You will be given a stipend, you can work in close proximity with say the bureaucrat or other administrative functionaries there. You will learn governance process in motion. So the Change Makers Fellowship is one. Then there is something called the Education Alliance. Education Alliance is actually a consortium of PPP organizations or individuals or a collective, so to say. And you will see that Center for Civil Society, a lot of these people who are a part of this, they are pushing through a lot of ideas with regard to experiences of some segments of private schools and seeing how this can operate in the public school system. You have this teacher mentorship model, which is a huge part. Now, teacher mentorship is not a new thing. In standard education practice or in standard teacher education frameworks, teacher mentors are a very common thing. But the teacher mentor language that is being used in a lot of the teacher training centers here or the leadership centers here is all the TFI model. So you'll see a lot of TFI fellows even taking the lead in these things. CreateNet, which does a lot of teacher training, lot of leadership training, is headed by a TFI alum. A lot of the language is TFI language. So you see these imprints of policy, not really, I'm not here like quantifying policy in the space of, okay, so this is their impact on policy, so to say, but I am really trying to channel their influences on policy through the alumni that are coming in. So I am restricting myself only to that much, and my comment is also only to that much. But I do see a significant influence of the alumni members in the large sector of the nonprofit space, which is a key sort of mover for policy reforms.
Is that clear? Okay. Thank you so much, Vidya, once again. Okay. Thank you again, Vidya. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.